In this section, we're actually going to solve some problems involving percents. We're going to use two different methods for this. One is what I'm going to refer to as the translation method. And if you're a grammar person, you might like this method because we are essentially translating. So if you like language or grammar, as if we were translating Spanish to English or English to Spanish, we're going to translate English into math. And then the second method we'll use is the proportion methods. We're going to start with some basic percent problems, and then we'll expand that to do some story problems. And we're going to solve each of these problems both of these ways, and we'll see how we get the same answer with either method. So we're going to start with this first one. This example is what is 30% of 120? So in this type of percent problem, we are given the percent and we're given what it's out of. What we're missing is the what part, right? The actual number itself. So I'm going to start with the translation method. And so if I'm using the translation method, usually what I do first is I look for in my sentence, in the question that I'm asked, where is my equal sign? And typically the equal sign is the word is, or it might say equals, or it might say is equal to, or it might even say is the same as, but all of those things mean equals. So in this case, it just has the word is. And it's typically my verb or part of my verb. If you like parts of speech or parts of a sentence, then you might like this. So is would be my equal sign. So that's going to translate to an equal sign. And then I'm going to translate the rest of this. So let's just kind of let that equal sign split this sentence in half, essentially. So what comes before the equal sign is the word what, right? And so if it says what or what number or what percent, that's what I'm trying to find. And in math, when I don't know what something is and I'm trying to find it, I let it be a variable. So you can use any variable you want. Typically, we would use X. If it's asking for a percent, we might use P, but you really can use any variable that you want, any letter. So what is literally translates as X equals. And then let's take the part after the equal sign, 30% of 120. So when you do the translation method, you want to go ahead and rewrite all of your percentages as decimals, or essentially translate your percent to a decimal. So 30% as a decimal would be 0.3, or if you want to write 0.30, that's fine. 3/10 or 30/100, same thing. So if you like that zero there, you can keep it. And we know that of means multiply. So then I would multiply that by 120. So what is 30% of 120 translates quite literally to X equals 0.3 times 120. And once you've translated this, then it's just a matter of using our algebra skills to solve this equation. So this one actually, X is already by itself. So I really just need to multiply here, 0.3 or 0.30 times 120. And if you just need to go off to the side and do that, that's perfectly fine. So 0.3 times 120, 3 times 0 is 0, 3 times 2 is 6, 3 times 1 is 3, and then I'll move the decimal over one space because it's over one here. And so I end up getting 36. The nice thing about these problems is you can always check the reasonableness of your answers. So look at that, take a second whenever you finish these problems and just say, hey, does that answer seem reasonable, right? So like if you had gotten, let's say you got 360 and you forgot to move over that decimal. If you take a second at the end here, you could say, okay, I was finding 30% of 120. Whoa, there's no way that 360 is 30% of 120. That's way too big, right? Or even an answer of like 100 here. 100's more than half of 120, right? So there's no way that it's 30%. So you can just kind of use that to check the reasonableness. So it's worth taking that extra moment at the end to do that. All right, before we move on to the next problem, I want to go ahead and also do this with the proportion method. And when you're taking a regular math class, this is up to you. What method you prefer? Do you prefer setting up proportions? Do you prefer translating it? As a teacher, though, I'm going to expect you to know both methods and be able to look at student work with both methods, because even if you prefer the proportion method, if your student prefers translation, you need to stick with what they prefer, right? And you need to be able to figure out what they're doing wrong or help them with it, or even instruct them on that method if that's the method they like. All right, so to set this up as a proportion, Let's pretend I don't know my answer yet. We're just going back to this problem. What is 30% of 120? And so there's a suggestion at the top here that says you can use this as a guide. You can do the is part over the of part, and the percent goes over 100. And that percent over 100 part, that makes sense based on what we know a percent is. I usually actually like to start with that. Whatever the percent is in my problem, I know that percent literally means out of 100. So 30% literally means 30 out of 100, and half of my proportion is done, right? So 30 over 100 equals, and then I just need to come up with the other half of my proportion with this other fraction. And so to do that, this is saying you put the is part on top and the of part on the bottom, which makes sense because we're going to talk about how much we have out of some other number. So in this case, it said, what is 30% of 120? So the of part is 120. That's what it's out of. The is part, the actual what this number is what I don't know. And so that's what I'm going to make my X. So this would be how I would typically set this up as a proportion. Not saying that it can't be done other ways. And we talked about that when we did proportions. So like technically if you had 30 over X equals 100 over 120, that would work. It's just not the typical way of doing it. Typically we would do the percent over 100 and then is over of. All right, so then from here you can solve with any method you like. Cross multiplication is pretty typical. So I'm going to just go ahead and solve with cross multiplication. 30 times 120 is going to be equal to 100 times X. And so then I'm going to go ahead and just off to the side, I'm going to do 30 times 120. Which really I could just do 3 times 12 and then attach 2 zeros would be my shortcut there. So 3600 equals 100x, and then to solve that for x, I would divide both sides by 100, and that gives me 36. So you get the same answer with both methods. So let's go ahead and do a couple more examples of this before we get to story problems. So this example says 18 is 45% of what number? So notice I know the percent, right? And this time I know the is part, right? What I'm trying to find is the of part, right? So on these types of problems, we're given the actual number itself, we're given the percent, we don't know what it's out of, and that's what we're trying to find. But this could be phrased different ways, and that's suggested here. So like, this is one way, 18 is 45% of what number, but this could be phrased of what number is 18, 45%, or 45% of what number is 18, right? So they could phrase that slightly differently. So again, I'm going to go through this with both the translation method and the proportion method, and I'm just going to start with translation. No reason for that. That's just how I'm choosing to do it. I know that is my equal sign. So I could start with that, and that's usually where I like to start. And then not always, but usually 1/2 of the equation is pretty easy. In this case, the only thing that comes before the word is 18. So 18 equals, and half of my equation is already written. And so then the rest of this is, how do I write 45% of what number? So 45% would translate as a decimal to 0.45 or 45 hundredths. Of means to multiply, and I'm going to multiply by what number. I don't know what that is, so I'm just going to use my variable. So I'm going to multiply by x. So 45% of what number means 0.45 times x, or whatever variable you choose to use. And now I'm just going to solve this equation. To solve this for x, I would divide both sides by 45 hundredths. So that's going to get the x by itself, and then just wherever I have some room, I'm going to go off to the side and do this division. Now remember that it's okay for your dividend to have a decimal, to be a decimal number, but it's not okay for your divisor. So this divisor being 45 hundredths is not okay. I'm going to have to move that decimal 2 spaces because that divisor has to be a whole number. And then that means that technically the decimal in 18 is behind the 8. We just don't usually show it. And you're going to have to move that decimal the same number of spaces to get this even, right? So this really becomes there's zeros behind the 18. So this becomes 1800 divided by 45, and that's an equivalent division problem. So I'm basically not going to worry about this one. And if I can find the answer to 1800 divided by 45, it's going to be the same answer as 18 divided by 45 hundredths. So 45 will go into 180. I happen to know this goes in 4 times, but if you don't happen to know that, you just guess at it until you find it. 4 times 5 is 20. 4 times 4 is 16 plus 2 is 18. So that actually goes in evenly, which is nice. But there is this extra 0 here to bring down. And 45, of course, won't go into 0, but you need to put that extra 0 as a placeholder. So we end up getting 40 here. And does that make sense? Is this reasonable? Well, yeah, so 45% is close to 50%, right? If I doubled 18, I'd get 36. 40 is pretty close to that, right? So is this answer reasonable? Yes, it is, right? Does it make sense that 18 would be almost half of 40, right? 45% is almost half. And then let's go through the proportion method. This one is cool. So if you want to do your is and your of part first and then your percent, it doesn't matter. I just usually start with the percent, whatever side you put it on. So in this case, 45% literally means 45 out of 100. So whichever half, your left or your right half, it doesn't matter, but that would be half of my proportion. And then it says 18 is 45% of what number? So I don't know the of part. I do know that the is part is 18. So it's 18 out of what I don't know. And I'm going to cross multiply to solve. So 18 times 100 would be 1800. X times 45 would be 45x. And then I'm going to divide both sides by 45. And then we can just go off to the side to do this, although we did this already, right? When we ended up moving the decimals in the last one, we ended up doing 1800 divided by 45. And then we got 40. One more, and then we'll move on to story problems. So we've done problems where we were looking for the is part, and now we've done problems where we're looking for the of part. The only type of problem that remains is problems where we're actually looking for the percent. So we know the is part, we know the of part, we don't know the percent. So I'm going to choose to do translation first, and I'm going to translate this question. 32 is what percent of 128? So 32 is would be 32 equals. And then what percent of 128? So whenever I see the word what or what number or what percent, that's where I would use my variable. So you can make this X or Y or Z or A or whatever you want. I'm typically going to use P when it's a percent, just to remind myself that my answer is a percent. So like to remind myself that I need to make sure I list it as a percent when I'm done. But you wouldn't have to do that. You can make it X or whatever variable you like. So what percent translates to P or whatever variable. Of means multiply. And in this case, I'm going to multiply it by 128. So what percent of 128 would translate to P times 128? And then to solve this for P, to get P by itself, I'm going to need to divide both sides by 128. So I'm just going to go off to where I have some room and do 32 divided by 128. Of course, 128 does not go into 32 evenly, so I'm going to go ahead and insert my decimal where it is, line that up in my quotient, and start the process of attaching zeros. So my guess here, I think this might go in 2 times. So let's see, 2 times 8 is 16, 2 times 2 is 4, plus 1 is 5, 2 times 1 is 2. So I'm getting 64 as a remainder there, so that was a good choice. But then I'm going to need to do this again, bring down a 0, 128 into 640. So I know if it went in twice, it was 256. I'm guessing I could do that again another 2 times. So I'm guessing maybe 4 would be a good guess, or maybe a little more than that. Maybe it's like 256 is going to be, if I double that, that's close to 500. So I might try 6. Or I'm sorry, not 6, but I'll try 5 and see how that goes. 5 times 8 is 40. 5 times 2 is 10 plus 4 is 14. 5 times 1 is 5 plus 1 is 6, and actually that worked out perfectly. So, and if you had tried 4, that just means you would have realized that you still had 128 left, so it would have gone in another time. And if you used 6, it would have been bigger than 640, and so you'd realize that you need to go down a little bit. So we end up getting P equals 0.25. And then this is the only part about these when you're trying to find a percent. This is why I like to remind myself by using P instead of X. You need to actually list your answer as a percent. So it gives you your answer as a decimal. You would need to go ahead and convert that to a percent by moving that decimal 2 places. So my answer here should be 25%. And is that reasonable that 32 is 25% or a quarter of 128? Yeah, that seems right. Then let's also do this with the proportion method. So I'm gonna just say, okay, I don't know the percent part, right? So I'm gonna just put that over 100. Again, I'm gonna use P, but you could use X or whatever you like there. So when I don't know the percent, I would just let it be P, and then I always put my percent over 100. Then we do is over of, right? So 32 is, so 32 is the is part. And then of 128, so 128 is the of part. So it's 32 out of 128, and I'm trying to figure out the percent. So then cross multiply. 128p equals 3,200. And then I'm going to divide both sides by 128 in order to get p by itself. So 3,200 divided by 128, you can go up to the side and do that. If you look at what we did already though, we basically did that. It's just if you did 3,200 divided by 128, the decimal point would have been here instead of where it was. So that means it's already a percent, right? So instead of getting 0.25, I just go ahead and get the answer. I kind of like that about the proportion method is that it already gives it to you as a percent. And so you just have to slap the percent sign on there. You don't have to actually convert it from a decimal like we did with translation method.